The crack of a whip echoed through the valley, followed by a woman's stifled cry. From the dark timberline, a massive shadow detached itself from the pines. Gideon's hand rested on the worn staghorn grip of his Colt. "Touch her again," the mountain man growled, "and you'll answer to me." The Wyoming Territory in 1884 was a place that did not forgive weakness. In the shadow of the Wind River Range, the town of Bitter Creek clung to the earth like a burr, populated by men who had run out of places to run, and women who had forgotten how to weep. Above them all, both in elevation and in local legend, lived Gideon Hayes. Gideon was a relic of a dying era. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad as a yoke and eyes the color of a winter sky, he was a man whittled down to bone and sinew by the harshness of the altitude. After serving as a cavalry scout during the bloodiest years of the Plains conflicts, he had climbed into the high country and refused to come down. He built a cabin out of heavy lodgepole pines, lived off elk and trapped beaver, and only descended to the valley twice a year to trade for coffee, salt, and black powder. The townsfolk whispered that he was more wolf than man, a feral spirit haunting the ridges. But beneath the heavy buffalo coat and the thick, unkempt beard beat the heart of a man who simply wanted to be left alone with his ghosts. That isolation fractured the day Amelia Dawson stepped off the stagecoach. Amelia did not belong in Bitter Creek. She possessed a refined sort of resilience, her posture straight despite the exhaustion etched into her delicate features. She had arrived from Ohio with nothing but a leather trunk, the fated deed to a 100-acre plot in the valley, and a desperate need to disappear. She had inherited the land from her late uncle, Elias, hoping it would be a sanctuary from a past she refused to speak of. What Amelia didn't know was that her modest 100 acres sat directly atop the only reliable year-round tributary feeding the massive grazing lands of Josiah Caldwell. Caldwell was a cattle baron in the most ruthless sense of the word. He sat on the executive committee of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and in Bitter Creek, his word was the law, enforced by a dozen hired guns. He had spent a year trying to starve out old Elias, and when the old man died of a sudden mysterious fever, Caldwell assumed the land was finally his. Amelia's arrival was an unacceptable complication. It was late October, the air already biting with the promise of snow, when Gideon guided his pack mule down the rocky switchbacks into Bitter Creek to secure his winter provisions. The town was choked with dust and the smell of cheap rye whiskey. Tying his mule outside O'Malley's mercantile, Gideon kept his head down, the brim of his slouch hat obscuring his eyes. Inside the store, the tension was thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. Amelia stood by the counter, her jaw set, clutching a sack of flour. Blocking her exit was Boyd Rutledge, Caldwell's chief enforcer. Boyd was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, sporting a jagged scar across his cheek and a smile that never reached his dead, dark eyes. Two other Caldwell men flanked the door. "I told you, Mr. Rutledge," Amelia said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "The land is not for sale. Not for $500. Not for $5,000. Boyd chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. He stepped closer, invading her space, reeking of stale tobacco and sweat. "Now, Miss Dawson, you're a long way from polite society. A woman alone out here. Accidents happen. Fires break out. Roofs cave in. It's a dangerous country. Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Boyd sneered. He reached out, his filthy, leather-gloved hand grabbing her wrist with a sudden, vicious jerk. The bag of flour hit the floor, bursting open in a white cloud. Amelia cried out in pain as Boyd's grip tightened, his thumb pressing cruelly into her fragile bones. "You'll sign the deed over to Mr. Caldwell by Friday, or you won't live to see the first snowfall." The heavy wooden doors of the mercantile swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. Gideon stood in the doorway, a towering silhouette against the bleak afternoon light. The entire store fell dead silent. Even the grizzled proprietor, O'Malley, ducked behind the counter. Gideon didn't say a word as he took 2 slow, deliberate steps inside. His boots thumped like drum beats on the hardwood. Boyd looked over his shoulder, his sneer faltering for a fraction of a second before his arrogance returned. "Mind your business, mountain man. This is association business." Gideon didn't look at Boyd. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Amelia's face, registering the pain, the fear, and the defiant fire burning beneath it. Something shifted deep inside his chest, a long-dormant protective instinct he thought the war had burned out of him completely. In one fluid motion, a movement terrifyingly fast for a man of his size, Gideon closed the distance. His left hand shot out, clamping around Boyd's throat like a steel vise. He lifted the enforcer an inch off the floor, cutting off his air instantly. Boyd's eyes bulged, his hand scrambling to break Gideon's grip, releasing Amelia. Gideon leaned in, his face inches from Boyd's turning purple. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "Touch her again," he growled, "and you'll answer to me." He threw Boyd backward. The enforcer crashed into a display of canned peaches, taking the shelving unit down with a thunderous clatter. Boyd's 2 deputies reached for their sidearms, but before their fingers even brushed leather, Gideon had his Colt, .45 drawn, the hammer cocked back with a sharp, lethal click. "I suggest," Gideon said softly, "you boys take your trash and leave." The deputies exchanged a panicked look, grabbed Boyd by his collar, and dragged the gasping, coughing enforcer out the door. Gideon slowly lowered the hammer and holstered his weapon. He turned to Amelia, who was rubbing her bruised wrist, staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. "You ought to head back east, ma'am," Gideon said gruffly, turning toward the counter to hand O'Malley his list. "Caldwell won't stop with a bruised wrist." "I have nowhere else to go," Amelia whispered, "and I won't be bullied out of what's mine." Gideon paused, looking back at her. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a tether attaching him to another human being. It was dangerous. It was foolish. He tipped his hat silently, grabbed his supplies, and walked out into the cold, leaving Amelia staring at the empty doorway. He rode back up the mountain that night, but for the first time, the solitude of the high peaks brought him no peace. 3 weeks passed. The Wyoming sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the first heavy snows began to threaten the valley. Up on his ridge, Gideon found himself spending hours staring down through his brass spyglass at the tiny ribbon of smoke rising from Amelia Dawson's chimney. He watched her chop wood. He watched her struggle to repair the roof of the dilapidated barn. He admired her sheer grit, a quiet resilience that fascinated him. But he also saw Caldwell's men riding the perimeter of her property, testing the boundaries like a pack of coyotes circling a wounded calf. The tension in the valley was a powder keg, and Gideon knew Josiah Caldwell well enough to know he was the man holding the match. Down in the valley, Amelia's situation was turning desperate. The general store refused to sell to her, citing pressure from the Cattle Association. Her well bucket had been poisoned with coal oil. But the breaking point came on a moonless Tuesday night. Amelia was asleep in her small cabin when the smell of sulfur and smoke jarred her awake. She bolted out of bed, grabbing the double-barreled shotgun her uncle had left behind. Outside, the night was illuminated by a hellish, roaring orange glow. Her barn, the only shelter she had for her milk cow and draft horse, was fully engulfed in flames. "Hey out there!" a voice shouted from the darkness. It was Boyd Rutledge. "Looks like you had an accident, Miss Dawson. Shame about the livestock." Amelia threw open the door, raising the heavy shotgun. Before she could aim, a gunshot rang out. The bullet shattered the doorframe inches from her head, sending a spray of sharp wood splinters into her cheek. She cried out, stumbling backward into the cabin. "Next one takes your pretty head off," Boyd yelled, his voice laced with venomous glee. "Burn the cabin, boys. Leave her out here to freeze." 3 men with torches broke from the tree line, running toward the house. Amelia scrambled to her feet, hands shaking as she tried to cock the shotgun, the smoke already slipping beneath her door and choking her lungs. She was trapped. Up on the ridge, Gideon had seen the glow. He had been riding down the mountain since the first spark hit the dry timber. He hit the valley floor like a force of nature. He didn't bother with a warning. As the first of Caldwell's men threw a torch onto Amelia's porch, the deafening roar of Gideon's sharps, 50 to 90 buffalo rifle, tore through the night. The man with the torch dropped instantly. A massive hole punched through his shoulder, screaming in agony. Boyd spun around, drawing his weapon. "It's the mountain man! Kill him!" Gideon spurred his massive black gelding straight into the firelight. He dropped the single-shot rifle and drew his Colt, firing on the move. He rode with the reckless, terrifying precision of a born cavalryman. A second Caldwell gun thug caught a bullet in the thigh and went down hard. Boyd, realizing the tactical disadvantage, fired wildly into the dark before spurring his horse and fleeing into the trees, leaving his wounded men behind. Gideon hauled his horse to a brutal stop, leaping from the saddle. He kicked the burning torch off the wooden porch and battered the front door open. "Amelia!" he roared. He found her on the floor, coughing violently, her face streaked with soot and blood from the splinter wound. Gideon scooped her up in his massive arms as easily as if she were a child. She dropped the shotgun, her hands instinctively clutching the thick, coarse fur of his buffalo coat. He carried her out into the freezing night air, far from the burning barn. Setting her down gently on the cold earth, he inspected the cut on her cheek. His large, rough thumb wiped a smudge of ash from her jawline. The touch was surprisingly tender for a man of his violent capabilities. "You're bleeding," he murmured, his voice tight with an anger that wasn't directed at her. "They killed my animals," Amelia choked out, the shock finally breaking her composure as tears cut clean tracks through the soot on her face. "They burned it down. I have nothing left." "They ain't done," Gideon said, scanning the dark tree line. He knew Caldwell's pride. Boyd would return with 20 men by daybreak to finish the job. "You can't stay here. The house is a target. You'll freeze, or you'll catch a bullet." "Where do I go?" she asked, her voice hollow. "The sheriff works for Caldwell." Gideon looked at her, his jaw clenching. He was a loner, a ghost. Bringing her into his world meant bringing the war to his doorstep. But as he looked at her shivering form, he knew there was no choice. He had made his decision the day he grabbed Boyd in the mercantile. "With me," Gideon said. "Up the mountain." He whistled for his gelding, hoisted Amelia into the saddle, and swung up behind her. He wrapped his heavy coat around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the biting wind. Together, they rode away from the burning ashes of her dream, up into the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the Wind River Range. By the time they reached Gideon's hidden cabin, the storm had broken. A blizzard howled through the pines, effectively erasing their tracks and cutting them off from the valley below. Inside the cabin it was warm, smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Gideon set Amelia by the hearth and poured her a tin cup of hot chicory coffee. For the first few days they barely spoke. The trauma of the attack lingered, and Amelia was terrified of her silent, imposing savior. But as the days turned into a week, the ice between them began to thaw. She noticed the small things, how he moved with absolute silence despite his size, how he carved delicate wooden figurines out of pine blocks by the firelight, how he slept with his revolver in his hand, a prisoner to his own violent past. One evening, as the wind battered the heavy log walls, Amelia watched him clean his rifle. "Why did you save me, Gideon?" she asked quietly. It was the first time she had used his name. Gideon didn't look up from the oiled rag in his hand. "No man has the right to do what they were doing to you. Caldwell thinks he owns the world." Amelia reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a folded, heavily worn oilskin packet. She had kept it hidden against her skin since she arrived. "But it's not just the water rights he wants. He knows what I have." Gideon finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What is that?" Amelia unfolded the parchment and spread it on the rough-hewn table. My uncle wasn't just a farmer. He was a surveyor for the Union Pacific. He found a new pass through the mountains, a route that cuts the freight time in half. But more than that, she traced a finger over a red line drawn across the map. This line proves that Caldwell's entire lower valley, his headquarters, his prime grazing land, is sitting entirely on federal land. He forged the land patents. If this map gets to the federal marshals in Cheyenne, Caldwell loses everything. Gideon stared at the map, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't just a dispute over 100 acres. This was an empire built on a lie, and Amelia was holding the single thread that could unravel it. "Does Boyd know you have this?" Gideon asked, his voice low and dangerous. "My uncle sent a letter to the territorial governor before he died," Amelia whispered. "I think Caldwell intercepted it. They know the map exists, and they know I'm the only one who could have it." Gideon stood up, walking to the frost-covered window, peering out into the howling, white darkness. The war he had left behind in the valleys had finally climbed the mountain to find him. "They'll wait for the snow to clear," Gideon said, turning back to her. His eyes were no longer the empty, haunted eyes of a recluse. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a soldier preparing for a siege. "Then Caldwell will send every gun he owns up this mountain. He can't afford to let you leave." Amelia stood up, walking toward him. She didn't flinch away from his imposing frame. She reached out, her small hand resting against his chest, right over his heart. "I brought this to your door, Gideon. I can leave. I can take my chances in the snow." Gideon looked down at her hand, feeling a profound, terrifying warmth spreading through his chest. He slowly reached up, his large hand covering hers. "You ain't going nowhere, Amelia," he said softly, a deadly promise ringing in the small cabin. "Let them come. They'll find out why the mountain belongs to me." The brutal Wyoming winter held the mountain in a frozen vice for 3 long months. Inside the cabin, however, a slow, quiet thaw was taking place. Forced into the intimate proximity of the single-room lodge, Gideon and Amelia forged a bond born of survival and sealed by mutual, unspoken respect. Gideon taught her the harsh realities of his world. He showed her how to skin a snowshoe hare, how to read the tracks of a mountain lion, and most importantly, how to load and fire his backup weapon, a heavy, dependable Remington 1858 revolver. Amelia, in turn, brought a sense of humanity to the feral trapper. She mended his worn shirts, read aloud from the few tattered books he kept on a shelf, and softened the hard, unforgiving lines of his daily existence. One evening, as the fire popped and hissed, Gideon watched her trace the lines of the surveyor's map. "My Uncle Elias told me this land was a promise," Amelia whispered, looking up into Gideon's weather-beaten face. "He said it was a place where a person could finally stand on their own feet, owing nothing to no one." Gideon leaned forward, his massive hands resting on his knees. "Caldwell don't believe in folks standing on their own. He believes in subjects. But up here, the land don't recognize men like Josiah Caldwell. The mountain only respects what you can survive." By late April, the Chinook winds began to howl through the peaks, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The snowpack began to weep, turning the slopes into treacherous slides of mud and slush. The pass was finally opening. Gideon did not wait for the inevitable. He transformed the approach to his cabin into a lethal gauntlet. Utilizing his years as a cavalry scout, he meticulously laid out defenses across the only navigable trail leading to his ridge, the Narrows Defile. He packed 2 heavy iron kettles with coarse black powder and rusted nails, burying them beneath a rockslide overhang, running a long fuse back to a hidden sniper perch. The switchback snares. He rigged heavy lodgepole pine deadfalls, suspended by thick hemp rope that could be severed with a single bullet. The final approach. He cleared the brush for 100 yards around the cabin, eliminating any cover for an advancing enemy. "When they come," Gideon instructed Amelia, Handing her the Remington and a box of cartridges, you stay inside the root cellar beneath the floorboards. You don't come out, no matter what you hear. If I fall, you take one of the mules out the back trail down the north face. You ride for Cheyenne and find Federal Marshal Tom Hatcher. Only him, you understand? Amelia gripped the heavy revolver, her knuckles white. I am not leaving you, Gideon. We fight together. This ain't a fight, Amelia, he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. It's an execution, and I'm the hangman. They didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the lower trail thawed, a flock of ravens suddenly took flight from the lower tree line, screaming in alarm. Gideon grabbed his Sharps buffalo rifle and moved to the window. Through his brass spyglass, he counted them. 18 men, heavily armed, riding single file up the treacherous, muddy path. At the head of the column, wearing a thick canvas duster, was Boyd Rutledge. Caldwell had sent his entire army. Gideon slipped out the back door, moving like a ghost through the timberline to his forward position. The tension hung in the damp air, thick and suffocating. As Boyd's men reached the narrowest part of the trail, their horses began to whinny and balk, sensing the unnatural quiet of the woods. Keep moving, Boyd barked, kicking his roan forward. He's just one man. We burn him out, take the girl, and we're drinking in town by sundown. Gideon knelt behind a massive granite boulder, a lit cigar resting in his teeth. He waited until the center of the column was directly beneath the rock overhang. He took the cigar, pressed the glowing cherry against the long, oil-soaked fuse, and picked up his rifle. The explosion tore the morning apart. A deafening roar echoed off the canyon walls as the black powder charges detonated. The cliff face fractured, sending a shower of jagged shale and dirt cascading down upon Caldwell's men. Horses screamed, rearing up in panic as 3 riders were instantly swept off the narrow ledge into the ravine below. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, Gideon Sharp's rifle boomed. Crack. A man next to Boyd plummeted from his saddle. Gideon worked the dropping block action with blinding speed, sliding another massive 50 to 90 shell into the breach. Crack. Another rider went down, clutching his chest. Panic erupted. The hired guns scrambled for cover behind dead logs and boulders, firing blindly up into the trees. He's up on the ridge, suppressing fire, Boyd screamed, his face a mask of rage and terror. Flank him, you cowards, flank him. The mountain became a slaughterhouse. Gideon retreated slowly, drawing the surviving men up through the timber. He led them perfectly into his traps. A bullet severed a rope, and a massive pine deadfall crushed 2 more deputies. But numbers have a cruel gravity, and eventually, the sheer volume of gunfire forced Gideon back to the perimeter of the cabin. He had taken a grazing shot to his left shoulder, the sleeve of his heavy coat slick with blood, but the pain barely registered. He was a creature of war, entirely consumed by the singular drive to protect the woman behind him. He dropped the empty rifle, drawing his twin Colt revolvers, and made his stand behind a stack of cordwood in the front yard. 5 men burst from the tree line. Gideon fired with terrifying accuracy, dropping 3 of them before his hammers clicked on empty cylinders. Suddenly, a massive, horrific crash echoed from behind him. Gideon! The scream tore through his soul. Gideon spun around. While he had been holding off the frontal assault, Boyd Rutledge and 2 men had scaled the sheer rock face at the rear of the cabin, smashing through the back window. Gideon abandoned his cover, sprinting toward the cabin door. A bullet tore through his thigh, dropping him to one knee, but he forced himself back up, kicking the heavy oak door completely off its iron hinges. Inside the wrecked cabin, Boyd stood with his forearm pressed viciously against Amelia's throat, using her as a human shield. In his other hand, he held a cocked Smith & Wesson squarely against her temple. Amelia was fighting fiercely, kicking and clawing, but the enforcer was too strong. "Drop 'em!" Boyd screamed, spit flying from his lips. His eyes were wide with a manic, cornered desperation. "Drop the irons, mountain man! or I scatter her brains across this floor." Gideon stood in the doorway, blood dripping from his arm and leg, pooling on the floorboards. He looked at Amelia. Her eyes were terrified, but she gave him a microscopic, desperate shake of her head. "Don't surrender. You've lost, Boyd," Gideon growled, his voice deathly calm despite the adrenaline raging in his veins. "Your men are dead. You pull that trigger, you ain't walking out of this valley." "I ain't walking out anyway," Boyd snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Caldwell will skin me alive if I don't bring him that map." Gideon slowly lowered his empty revolvers, letting them clatter to the wooden floor. He raised his hands, taking a slow, agonizing step forward, heavily favoring his uninjured leg. "That's right, you feral freak," Boyd laughed, a hysterical edge to his voice. "Get on your knees." "I told you once, Boyd," Gideon said softly, locking eyes with the enforcer. "Touch her again, and you'll answer to me." At that exact second, Amelia acted. With a primal scream, she stomped the heavy heel of her boot directly onto Boyd's instep, simultaneously driving her elbow backward into his ribs. Boyd gasped, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second, his gun barrel dipping away from her head. It was all the opening Gideon needed. With an explosive surge of strength, ignoring the agony in his leg, Gideon launched himself across the room. He didn't reach for a weapon. He hit Boyd with the force of a runaway freight train, tackling him through the front window. The two men crashed through the glass and shattered timber, tumbling out into the muddy, snow-patched yard. Boyd scrambled frantically, trying to raise his pistol, but Gideon was on him like a grizzly. Gideon's massive hand clamped down on Boyd's wrist, twisting it until a sickening snap echoed across the yard. Boyd shrieked, dropping the gun. Gideon hauled the enforcer up by his duster, his fist pulling back like a sledgehammer. He hit Boyd once, a devastating blow that shattered the man's jaw, sending him crashing into the mud, unconscious before he even landed. The yard fell dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the mountain man. The few remaining Caldwell men hidden in the trees, seeing their leader broken so easily, broke ranks and ran for their lives down the trail. Gideon stood over Boyd's ruined body for a long moment, swaying slightly. Then he heard the crunch of boots on glass behind him. Amelia rushed out, tears streaming down her face, ignoring the mud as she threw her arms around Gideon's waist, burying her face in his chest. Gideon staggered slightly from the impact, but wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "It's over," he whispered hoarsely. "It's done." 2 weeks later, the doors of the federal courthouse in Cheyenne burst open. United States Marshal Thomas Hatcher, flanked by 6 heavily armed federal deputies, marched directly into the lobby of the Wyoming Grand Hotel. Josiah Caldwell was sitting in a velvet chair, sipping imported brandy, when the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The federal warrants, backed by the undeniable proof of Amelia Dawson's map, brought an absolute and sudden end to Caldwell's bloody empire. Back in the valley of Bitter Creek, the summer sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range in vibrant gold and green. On the ashes of her old barn, a new one was being raised, the heavy timber cut and hauled by a man who had finally come down from the mountain. Gideon wiped the sweat from his brow, his scars healing, his eyes clear of the ghosts that had haunted him for a decade. He looked toward the porch of the newly rebuilt cabin, where Amelia stood, smiling as she poured fresh water from the well. He had saved her life, but as he walked toward her, taking her hand in his rough, calloused grip, he knew the truth. Amelia Dawson hadn't just saved his land, she had saved his soul. Did Gideon's brutal brand of frontier justice leave you breathless? If you loved this gritty, action-packed Western romance and want more thrilling stories of outlaws, mountain men, and untamed love, hit that like button and share this video with your fellow storytelling fans. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an adventure. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Amelia's shoes? See you on the next trail.
Hi, my name is Famman, the owner and manager of Sunrise Ruthless Love. After watching the video, touch her again, and you'll answer to me, he growled. The loner mountain man chose justice over fear. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the courage it took for both Gideon and Amelia to stand their ground when fear would have been the easier choice. Gideon spent years hiding from the world, yet he chose to protect someone who needed help. Amelia, even after everything she faced, refused to give up what was rightfully hers. Do you think Gideon would have stepped in if Amelia had never shown such strength herself? And which moment in the story stood out to you the most? If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories and the lessons they leave behind, a like or subscription is always appreciated. Thanks for watching and being part of the channel.